You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Blaine Pardoe, author of A Special Kind of Evil, the book of record on the Colonial Parkway Murders. Blaine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Can you start by telling us how you became aware of the Colonial Parkway Murders and when you decided to write a book about it?
Back around, I want to say 2014, 2015, my daughter and I had finished our last book on an unsolved murder in Michigan, and we were looking for something closer to home. And we started taking a look at various crimes that were unsolved in Virginia, and the Colonial Parkway Murders rose to the top. And as I started going through it, I've never tackled a serial killer before, and that had some appeal, etc. And as we started taking a look more and more at it, there wasn't a lot of material actually out there at the time about this case. That's changed in the last 2 or 3 years at least, if not 5 years. And so we started a 2-year research junket to start actually working on this, and started with interviews with family members that we were able to track down, and that got us a little more motivated as we started that process. Then that led us to doing some more digging and speaking with former law enforcement and things along those lines to try and get as much information as we could out there about the cases.
Yeah, I remember you and I spending a fair amount of time on the phone talking about the case, and you were really building your knowledge base and then moving out to talk to family members and potential witnesses, law enforcement. You really worked the research side of the thing very hard. It was a lot of fun. We met some fantastic people along the way, and people I still keep in contact with, present company included, but it was fun in some respects to do this because you felt like you were actually making a little bit of a difference. Getting a book out there about a case like this actually generates tips. It generates leads. It keeps it in the public's eye. And you need that on a case that's this old because it's so easy, especially in these days where we've cut money to law enforcement, which almost always hits the cold case files. Keeping the information out there and keeping people talking about it is the best way to make sure that action's taken on the part of law enforcement. So let's steer back to 3 weeks ago now. What was your first reaction when you viewed the January 8th press conference? They announced this link between Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., and they indicated that he was responsible as a result of DNA testing for the deaths of Robin Edwards, David Knobling, and Teresa Howell. What was your first reaction?
I got to be honest with you, the very first thing when I saw it, and I got bombarded by people going, "Are you watching the press conference?" And I'm like, "What press conference?" And by the time I got to it, it had already wrapped. And then by the time I saw it, it was post-conference. But when I was watching it, the first thing that hit me was when I saw the truck. I literally had a chill go down my spine because we had talked to Irv Wells about that vehicle and about Wilmer. I didn't have his name at that point. Irv couldn't remember his name specifically, stumbled through it. I dug up my notes on our interview just a couple days ago to go back over it again to see did I miss something, and he couldn't remember exactly what the guy's name was, but we had changed the license plate in the book because he said we cleared this guy, and he said, "Are you going to put the license plate in?" And I said, "That would be my preference." And he goes, "If you do that, people are going to harass this guy if he's kept the license plate." We said, "We have cleared this guy," and we changed it. It made sense to do that. And we do that occasionally with witnesses and things along those lines. But when I saw that truck, I had a chill go down my spine. I was like, oh my God, the FBI They had this guy, they had him under surveillance, they confronted him, they gathered evidence from Alan Wilmer Sr., and they went through all of this, and they polygraphed the guy and let him go. And now it turns out that was on the Hailey case. But now he's implicated in a different one of the Colonial Parkway murders and an additional murder, Teresa Howell, which now I'm caught in this quandary. And I'm sure you probably felt the same way, Billy. You in your mind, you start going, so is this person now part of the Colonial Parkway murders? Or is it do you treat it as a separate murder and things along those lines? And you start trying to go, oh my God, now that they've got him on these cases, can they now nail this guy on all of the other cases or any of the other cases? He was the prime suspect on Hailey. And we're talking 4 days after all of this was when the FBI started hounding this guy. I was stunned, and I was really shocked that the FBI didn't come right out and say, this guy was on our radar. I went back through the conference twice going, are they going to say that? Or did anybody ask that question? It was very hard to hear the press questions, period.
And that, I believe, was deliberate. There's two things, having run a lot of press conferences. You either put a microphone out where the reporters are so the audience can hear the questions, or standard protocol, which was not done in this press conference, is if you don't put a microphone out where people can hear the questions being asked by the reporters, you repeat the question. And they didn't do that either. No. And the question was actually asked by Andy Fox twice.
Yeah, it just was frustrating. I've been a little displeased with the response to that, because from where I sat, there's a lot of implications. You look at the whole Waterman theory, which really came up with the death of your sister. They took a look, that's when they formulated this profile that it had to be a waterman. There was a nautical line. That was the word that Irv Wells used, nautical, that was used in the first pair of murders. There was a very sharp knife, which they characterized as the type of knife that could have been used by a waterman. You had diesel fuel being used in that first crime, and a lot of the watermen, they don't buy their diesel fuel down at the docks. They buy it at gas stations, et cetera, because it's much cheaper to do so.
Right. And
transport it. And that was how that all formulated in the first place. And it was with the third pair of murders, they started cracking that again with Hailey, looking at that profile. And here they had somebody that was a known stalker on the Parkway and who was confrontational with people. The example that Irv gave me was he confronted one couple because he thought it was two girls kissing. And that made me immediately think of your sister and Becky. It's like you just go, wow, what is this? How did you miss this all this time? You had access to better material than I did. I was relying on Irv Wells in an interview decades later. The FBI's had this information for some time. I found it a little disingenuous. I really was hoping they would have said more about, we've been looking into this guy.
Why do you think that they failed to announce that at the press conference? Because they didn't announce that he was a lead suspect. They did not announce, hey, we'd been looking at this guy for a while. Why do you think they kept it quiet?
I think they're worried about the reputation of the FBI. I hate seeing stuff like that because I don't know. I have to guess. If I'm making a guess, they're protecting the reputation of the FBI. And I understand that. But let's be open and honest with the families here, especially the Hailey families, and say, look, this was the guy we had on our radar and we dropped that ball. And I haven't talked to Joyce specifically about this, but I don't think that's been the case. I don't think they've been open and honest 100% on this. And maybe it's because they're still doing a very active investigation and they're at some point going to reveal everything. But I got to be honest with you, I'm getting stonewalled on my FOIA requests for these allegedly closed cases across the board at this point. And it's getting frustrating as someone who wants to write the last chapter or two of this book.
Explain for our listeners, Blaine, if you would, what a FOIA request is and how it works.
Government agencies, usually with the exception of Congress, are required to respond to what's called a Freedom of Information Act request, which is anybody who's a citizen can make a request of the FBI, of Virginia State Police, of local law enforcement, and say, I desire a copy of this information because it's public information. Now, on closed cases, generally I found nobody releases very much information. Usually with the FBI, you get what's called VICAP information, which is their tracking database for tracking crimes. And they usually enter like a lot of detail about the crime scene and investigative officers and stuff into that. I've gotten that on the Freeway Phantom case with no problem. What with a closed case is you can get the entire file. You can get photographs. You can get all of the information. They usually redact out people's addresses, social security numbers, driver's license numbers. You can't give away somebody's birthday and name because that can backfire and be used for information theft. They usually redact the files and send them to you. And I've got tons of those things that I use for other cases. I filed immediately when this started. I started filing FOIA requests because I said, okay, you've closed Knobling, you've closed Edwards, and you closed Teresa Howell.
And they said so at the press conference.
That's what they said. This is the guy we would be trying. So I filed FOIA requests. Now, Virginia state law allows the owning agency, in this case, Virginia State Police, to withhold information. The FOIA law allows them to do that. They took the stand with me, and the response I got back to say, these cases aren't closed. And I was like, that's not what you just told everyone in the world.
Yeah, they said
I
that. I
reached out to Isle of Wight, and I said, no, I know the sheriff of Isle of Wight conducted an investigation because I interviewed him.
Yes, I remember that. So
I filed a FOIA with them, and they said, we don't have any files related to this case.
I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I've met with Isle of Wight years later and had some very good conversations with them. I remember meeting with Lieutenant Tommy Potter and other folks, and them responding this way years later. I don't believe that to be factually correct. Isle of Wight does have files. They investigated the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling. Ultimately, it became a Virginia State Police case. As we understand it, and I know you covered this in the book, Blaine, Isle of Wight didn't have the resources. It was a very small department back then, and Isle of Wight was kind of a quiet, very beautiful bit of a backwater in the 80s. Yeah. So they handed the case off, but they have files. I know they have files.
I know they do too. And I found that disingenuous. I reached out to Hampton, and Hampton said they're going to respond, which I was surprised. And that's on the Teresa Howell case. So what I got back from them a week ago, I hadn't looked at immediately when I got it because it said, we're sending you the incident report. And what I got was an incident report that doesn't even have her name on it.
Wow, that's clear.
It is almost like I got back a blank form. No investigative officers, no description of the murder, nothing. It is a blank form. There's this whole mechanism that's being applied here of we're not going to release that information. And I find that a little bit frustrating, obviously, but there's ways around that. And I'm trying to pursue some of those kind of back avenues to get what I want. I did get some good response from Lancaster, at least their police department, when I asked about Alan Wilmer and Keith Wilmer. I asked for what are their arrest records. And they didn't give me the incident reports, but they did give me a list of what they've been arrested for.
Ooh, very interesting.
Yeah. Want to know?
Yeah,
we would love to know. Yes, please.
Please, let's go over this.
Yes,
because
let's go over it.
Okay, this is, I haven't made this public before.
We get the scoop. All right.
You guys all get the scoop. Everybody who's listening to the podcast, start jotting this down. Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. on the 29th of October, 1981 was charged with curse and abuse. On the same day, he was also charged with assault and battery. William Keith Wilmer was charged on November 18th, 1971, with indecent language on the phone. On September 8th, 1983, he was charged with making an obscene phone call. On the 22nd of October, 1983, he was also charged with making an obscene phone call. Now, we know the latter two of those calls, if you look at that article in the Washingtonian on Murder on the Rappahannock, we know that those two calls were specifically mentioned, that he was calling someone who worked at a bank. So we know those two calls. These guys really, they have, I say it's an unremarkable arrest report. I've never been arrested, so I have nothing on my report, and I'm sure most of you do either. So I look at it and go, these aren't huge arrest reports, but there's something there. What I look at is, what are the dates? Because are there trigger dates with any of these that align to the Colonial Parkway murders? And my genealogist, Gene, has also been looking at the dates of his divorce, right, mother's birthday, mother's death day, all of that stuff. Because I know, and Bill, you and I talked about this, it's like the day my mother died, every time it comes up, every year, the anniversary, I have an emotional day.
Yeah. Without question. Me too, as a matter of fact.
And I took a look at all those, and none of those dates aligned to any of the Colonial Parkway murders. So I don't think it's a trigger date for these guys. I don't know. And I'm looking at both of these guys for a reason, because while Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was the one implicated by DNA in these three murders, there's always been a theory that there's two people that may have been involved with the Colonial Parkway murder. You read that article on Murder on the Rappahannock, you start wondering, okay, is William Keith Wilmer in any way possibly tied to this? Was this a thing that the two brothers went out and did?
And when you look at the article, Murder on the Rappahannock, which we do recommend, and we'll link in the show notes for this conversation, it's very clear that this man, Emerson Stevens, did not kill Mary Harding and dump her body on the Rappahannock River. Keith Wilmer is mentioned specifically and by name as a suspect in this horrific homicide, which is still unsolved after all these years.
Yeah, I took a look at that, and I think the most chilling thing for me, and I'm sure it was for you and Kristin as well, when you see the way the body was weighed down in the river with a cement block and chain, it's hard not to think of Keith and Cassandra from the Colonial Parkway murders. Clearly, the FBI thought their bodies had been dumped in the river. Now you're looking at someone who had access to a boat, who potentially, we don't know for sure that Keith Wilmer was involved with that crime, but he certainly is implicated in the article with it, who weighed down a body before in the river. Did he get better at it? And this time he knew where to dump it, or to use a better way to attach the weights or whatever. It certainly does add up why no one stumbled across, with all the construction that's been going on down in that area. No one's ever stumbled across a shallow grave with human remains in it.
Especially now that we know we're working with a suspect who's a waterman. The rivers, for folks that haven't been to the Colonial Parkway, the James and York Rivers are right there. And clearly, if we look at Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, there's an attempt to push Kathy's Honda into the York River. That's followed a year later by Robin Edwards and David Knobling. We know their bodies were dumped in the water. That's the James. And we now know that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for their deaths. Then we move forward about, 8 months or so. Yeah. And Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, and here Wilmer again is clearly linked, not necessarily via DNA yet, but he is clearly suspect number one, as you referred to him.
Yeah.
In that disappearance. And the river's right there. I'm sorry, Kristin, go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you look too at the crimes that are bracketing Ragged Island and Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, I'm wondering if he has anything to do with the disappearance of Brian Pettinger and Laurianne Powell, both of whom were found in the river. So I do think there's a good possibility that he finally figured out, here's how I weigh a body down and make a body disappear in a body of water.
Yeah, Bill and I were talking a little bit before the show about this. I think we've really got to do what's called geographic profiling on this and look at all the places where the victims were last seen, plot those on the map. Then you plot as well where the bodies were found. You plot where in this case, we now have a suspect can be plotted. If you do all of that, there's very sophisticated programs that have been written that look at traffic patterns and things along those lines to really then sketch out what the sphere is and where the heart of that sphere is, because that's usually a place where one of the killers has some sort of connection to, be it things along those lines. And there's a guy by the name of Rosso who's written the book on geographic profiling, and it's absolutely phenomenal to go through it. It's a science all on its own. It's fascinating to go through, but it's very useful to pin down a little bit too of what the range of these guys are. Everybody has always said, and I'm sure you guys have heard this time and time again, they say the last two murders, they always say those probably weren't the Colonial Parkway murder. They always throw in Ragged Island and go, that probably wasn't the Colonial Parkway murder because it's not on the Colonial Parkway. Mm-hmm. And for people who don't live down there or who haven't driven that area or know the area, we're talking 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and that's in present day traffic, mind you, to get to these locations. And now that you know where these guys live, which is up in the Northern Neck, up in Lancaster, and you start looking at their geographic range, suddenly you go, wait, their range is pretty big. And if I was in law enforcement right now, I'd be dusting off every single unsolved murder and taking it, putting it under the microscope and going, could these guys, one of these guys at least, Alan Wilmer, be responsible for that?
And one of the things that's very clear, and the FBI and Virginia State Police and Hampton PD said this as well, was that Alan Wade Wilmer was highly transient. He often lived on his boat, which puts him right in the middle of the Tidewater area where the Colonial Parkway Murders epicenter is. So he's living on his boat for weeks or months at a time, docked right nearby and working those waterways.
Yeah, he worked out of Gloucester. He literally was a quarter mile to a half mile from where two of the murder scenes were. I shouldn't say murder scenes, one murder scene and one car abandonment scene in the case of Call Hailey.
Blaine, we have so many listener questions for you that we want to go ahead and jump right in. Everyone was so enthusiastic to know that you were going to be on the podcast. So I think we're just going to try to do as many as we can.
Sure.
And go from there. So I'll MC it and read you the question and the first name of the listener, and we'll just go from there. If we need to, we'll do a speed round. So the first question is from Heather, who asks, was Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. at the top of your personal list of who you feel was responsible after writing this book? And then she follows it up with, did you even have a top list?
He was not at the top of my list. And I really, if I was an arrogant bastard, I would say, oh, yes, he was all along. I'm going to be honest here. He was not at the top of my list. I have gotten so many tips over Ron Little and Steve Blackman over the years. They were, and given Blackman's recent criminal history and stuff, they were higher on my list. Not so much Ron Little, but definitely Steve Blackman's name has come up so many times. It was hard for me to not think of them as potential targets in this. Yeah, but there was a lot of people there's a lot of people in various cases as tied to the Colonial Parkway murder, a lot of potential suspects that were on the radar that I was like, they're at least worth taking another look at. And this was one of those. This was one that was worth taking another look at.
Hailey asks, do you think Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for all of the Colonial Parkway murders?
I don't know for sure, but boy, it needs to be explored. Whether he did it alone, I don't know. I think it's certainly now possible. Now that we have a name, we need to take a more serious look at what other evidence can tie this person to this. And I think a very logical place to go, in my opinion, is go back to that list of everybody that was at the party at University Square Apartments. Go out there and say, this guy, did you see him in the parking lot? Did you see him at the party? Did you see him floating around? Did you see this truck anywhere? Now that you've got a tangible piece of evidence with these photographs, you can go back to all of those people. And I would be very disappointed if the FBI wasn't calling up every single one of them and going back to that. I think they've got to do that. I think they've got to also take a look at all of the instances where someone was confronting someone on the parkway, because that's how Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. got into this in the first place. He was very aggressive in confronting people on the parkway. Now that you've got his picture and stuff, go back to all of those cases. And again, now it's even worse because you're dealing with the park police, which is a whole different subject with me. They're making the FBI look good. That's my view of the park police, is they make the FBI look really good. You need to go back on all of those and you have to pry this case back open and expose it to the new evidence and go, hey, did somebody see this?
People are coming out of the woodwork, Blaine, and I know it's happening with you as well. Kristin and I are hearing from a number of people, and they are coming forward now, and they are saying, I was accosted by that man, short, muscular, driving, in some cases, the exact same truck that we've seen in the press materials, this blue-green work truck, 1966 Dodge, which was very distinctive and old in 1988.
Yeah.
And they're coming forward. And what's really frustrating is they have told me they reported this to the National Park Service and the FBI back when it happened, after the murders. So the disconnect here in this case is just baffling. How did Alan Wade Wilmer slide when so many people were coming forward and saying, I had a very scary or uncomfortable encounter with this man where he came up to us and demanded driver's licenses. He wasn't wearing a cop uniform. He was typically wearing like a mechanic's uniform, which a waterman might wear, behaving incredibly aggressively towards these couples. They live to tell the tale, but you're absolutely right. It's imperative that the FBI go back and re-interview all the people that were at that party. There's a big discussion going on as we speak on the Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey page on Facebook, run by our friends from the Call family. And there's a number of people that were there at the party who were saying, I was there that night, I saw Keith and Sandy. These people need to be re-interviewed.
Yes, they absolutely do. And I'm hoping and praying that's exactly what the FBI and the Virginia State Police are doing. I know if I was in charge of this case, that's what I would be doing. I would be doing a forensic diagnosis of every aspect of this family's life. I'd be pulling up every credit card report that has ever been produced for these guys. I would be looking for every bit of information to formulate the case. I certainly hope that's the case. I don't know if that is, but I would certainly hope that would be the case.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Do you think, this is from Patricia Marie, and Patricia says, do you think that if it wasn't for Irv Wells telling you that Wilmer was the first suspect in the Call Hailey murder and you putting the information in your book, that the FBI might not have eventually fessed up to it?
Other people knew about that. And I've talked, during the writing of the book, I talked to Bill about this, and Bill was aware of it. I also talked with the Call family about this, and they were aware of it. Other people knew about it. I know Andy Fox used the book to pose his articles in question. Andy carries around a dog-eared copy of this book everywhere he goes. I think the book made it so that they had to respond to it because it was out there and there was no way around it. I don't know if their response was fully appropriate. I think they needed to be a little more open and honest. Personally, they have on numerous occasions with school shootings come out and said, oh, this person was on our radar, we dropped the ball. I really think the families deserve that statement from them, that this guy was on our radar, we dropped the ball. I don't think they're ready to do that yet, and I don't know why, other than they're protecting their reputation.
Yeah, the FBI seems to be having a bit of a problem with transparency in this particular case, and I certainly hope that they begin to become more transparent about it in the future. Next question is from Heather, who says, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. died at the end of the same year the book was published. Is there any possibility Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. read your book and spooked?
I'm going to phrase this in two different ways. I doubt it. He didn't look like the reading kind of guy. From the pictures I saw, he's not. I have started to go through, because I took pictures every time we did an event. I'm starting to go through those pictures now to see if him or his brother were actually in the audience of any of our public events, because we had 200 people show up on some of these events.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. I remember your event at the Yorktown Library. That was a sellout.
Yeah, we took a lot of pictures of the audience because you never know who might show up. I will say this, on several occasions, the FBI has reached out to me and asked if I could get a list of everybody who's read my book. And Amazon doesn't give us that. It's sacred. It's sacred material for obvious reasons. And it's weird that they asked me on 2 occasions for that. So clearly, I think they want to check that avenue as well.
Let me add something there.
I don't know.
Let me add something there, if I may. I'm not sure that Wilmer has read the book, but he has an extensive family of children and grandchildren. Now, his kids would be in their 40s now and married, and they have kids of their own, some of whom are in their 20s now.
Yeah.
I don't think it's out of the question, and you guys did a great job with the publicity when you and Victoria worked the media and you went out and you did book talks, you did book signings, you appeared in a variety of places. There were a lot of articles written and a lot of media coverage in Virginia. Of course, you're talking about a Virginia case. I don't think it's out of the question that someone on the Northern Neck became aware of the fact that there was a book about the Colonial Parkway murders, which was creating quite a splash in 2017 when the book was published. I don't think it's out of the question that someone said, have you looked at this book? And if you turn to page 204, that's when you tell the story about the Waterman.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule it out, Bill. I just don't want to sound too egotistical to go, oh, yeah, the murderer was keeping up on me. When I saw that guy's pictures, my first thought was, this guy's a pretty scuzzy guy. I doubt he did a lot of reading. Mm-hmm. He just didn't he personally doesn't strike me as the kind of person that did a lot of reading. But I could be wrong. I could be forming an opinion based on a photograph. I don't know. I will be shocked if that's the case, but at the same time, there's been a lot of shocks lately, so I'll take it.
Bill, I'm going to switch up the order here real quick and just cover all the Wilmer stuff all at once. And then I'll get to CPM case specific stuff.
Sounds good.
Okay. Another gentleman with the name of Blaine, who says, great name, by the way, asks, what was Wilmer's initial response to police when he was observed cleaning and repairing the bed of his truck?
I don't have that information. I know that police were so concerned that expedited getting the warrant because they were fearful he was destroying evidence. I don't know if he actually was aware that he was being watched. I suspect he was, if he was doing this level of cleaning and attempting to purge stuff. That certainly seems to me that he may have spotted a white van up the road type thing.
Okay. Tammy asks, do you know of any of the places that Wilmer may have worked or docked out in Gloucester County while he was living and working on his boat?
I don't. And the reason is I've pulled up on Google Earth and started looking at various docks where watermen worked, etc. The problem is I don't have an accurate map of that for the 1980s. And things actually do change quite a bit in that regard. So I really don't have that at this point in time. I do know I've had several people tell me that he regularly docked in Gloucester. That I've had a couple of people reach out to me and let me know that.
You actually addressed Julie's first question already, which is what type of criminal record for petty or major crimes did Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. have?
Yeah.
But she also wants to know, can you tell us more about various incidents of harassment on and off the Colonial Parkway in the area around the time of these crimes?
Well, I think Bill's probably addressed a lot of those. I did get one interesting anecdotal story about Wilmer from someone just the other day, and I'm not going to reveal who it is, but he said, I don't remember this, but my dad did. He was on a junior baseball team, and Wilmer was there and drunk and was so angry at the call so the umpire was making, he was climbing up on the backstop. They had to pull him down. And he said the general tone that everybody had in that area was if you could avoid contact with the Wilmers, you did. That they were rowdy, boisterous, they were overly engaging, shall I say. I would say aggressive was the word that wasn't used, but that's the word I would use.
Sounds about right. Erica asks, do we know the identity of the second person who was interviewed and polygraphed with Wilmer?
No, I don't know. And unfortunately, Irv Wells has died, because I think Irv Wells, honestly, the tone I got with the interview, he always felt that this was his guy. And I think if you read page 205 and stuff, you get that part of the book, you get the vibe that Irv Wells knew this was his guy, and his polygrapher was telling him it wasn't. Wish I knew. Polygraphs don't clear anybody at this point. And so now I think you really got to question a lot of that.
We have people who have very obviously spent a lot of time on the case, and they have a couple of different possible suspect and accomplice theories that we want to run past you as well before we get into more case-specific detail. Okay. So the first question from Katie is, did Fred Atwell ever have any connection to or relationship with Alan Wade Wilmer that we know of?
I don't know of any, and that's a great question. It certainly needs to be explored.
I think it's a good question, too. Continuing in that vein, Lori asks, do you know if Wilmer had any connection to Ron Little or Steve Blackman?
Yeah, great questions. I have never seen anything in the research I've done on this, or that my daughter Victoria's done on this, that showed a connection to them.
This is something I think all of us are looking into, though, because I'm actually starting to hear of some potential intersection between Alan Wade Wilmer and Ron Little, which would center around the Tidewater area and Gloucester. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
That would be interesting.
The next two questions regard other notorious Virginia cold cases. Richard asks, might there be any evidence that Wilmer was considered a suspect in the Shenandoah National Park crimes? And he's referencing there the murder of Julie Williams and Lally Winan in Shenandoah in 1996, for anybody who's not familiar. What do you think, Blaine?
The state police have DNA from that crime scene. While it was poorly handled by a park ranger who actually worked in the Colonial Parkway at one point, and it was mishandled, they do have DNA in that case. And I would think really all it's got to happen is a comparison. Now, has that happened? I'm not privy to it. Now, Bill, you may be. I don't.
I'm not, and forgive me if I sound cynical, but I'll believe it when I see it. That the
other one's got to be the Route 29 one, because everybody highlights the Route 29 one and they go, could this be this? I live on not far from Route 29. I drove that road quite a bit in my life. I don't know if they're there, but now what we have geographically, we know that the range that these guys operated in was long. Okay. This was not. Everybody who's always said, oh, you got to ignore Phelps Lower, it's not part of the Colonial Parkway Murders, or, oh, you got to skip Ragged Island, that doesn't count. Guys, the map is big on this at this point, and these guys traveled considerable distances. I'm not willing to say yes or no on that. I think they would be stupid to not be checking it.
And then, Blaine, just tangentially related to Route 29, but something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago before all of this blew up. There is some theory that Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer suspect, might also be the Route 29 stalker. I see you rolling your eyes. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I know who brought that up. Just curious what your thoughts are on it. Yeah, but I think the eye roll gives it away.
There's a few people out there with crackpot theories that have tried to force them in. And I don't remember the woman's name, but she's pushed this on me and got all upset when I didn't embrace it. There's nothing that proves that. And I've actually had tips come in where I've turned more of the Virginia State Police on the Route 29 killer that are pretty good tips. And I've never heard back, but that's not uncommon when you turn in a tip to law enforcement. They don't call you up and go, it didn't work out, or it did work out. They just thank you and move on. I don't know. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. This person was the same person that raised this with me. And if it's the same person raising you, connects this same person to every unsolved serial killing case up and down the East Coast. That's their whole motive thing, is if there's an unsolved crime, they're sure this person is responsible. And I just don't subscribe to that. Show me the evidence.
Our thoughts too. Let's get back to some case-specific questions that people just wanted clarification on. So the first question, and again, we know that some of this you may not be aware of, and that's totally fine. The question is, what caliber was the gun that was used on Ragged Island? And do we know if it matched any of the guns in Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s house?
What I do know is they initially thought it was a .44 caliber. They're fairly convinced, because the mutilation of the bullet, et cetera, and the size, that it was a .38 caliber. What I don't know was, were any weapons recovered from Alan Wade Wilmer's possession? I have no idea. I think that's a great question that the FBI, I'm sure, should be taking a look at, as well as the Virginia State Police. But have they found a weapon? Can they match it up to the ballistics for that single bullet that was recovered? I don't know.
Okay. And that was from Charlie. Jennifer asks, now that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. has been confirmed to be the killer of David and Robin, are there any possible links between him and Sammy Reeder? It is interesting that Reeder died in 1989 after the last of the Colonial Parkway murders. Perhaps they were a team, and his death is why the murders stopped. That's from Jennifer.
That's a great question. I have never heard of Wilmer's name in my discussions with the former Isle White Sheriff. On this case, at no point did they bring up Wilmer's name, so I don't know if there's a connection there. I would certainly hope the authorities are taking a good look at it. It's a good question, though.
Now, Samuel Reeder did put himself at the scene where Robin and David were killed. And he did admit, I believe, that he went into the truck and I think stole money from David's wallet, if I'm not mistaken. So he does put himself there. Correct, Blaine?
Yeah, he does. That doesn't necessarily mean that he had anything to do with it. It could be that he did exactly what he said he did and stole some cash and poked around the truck. Yeah. Ragged Island attracted a weird group of people and still does from time to time. I've been down there. It's always a little creepy when I go.
Oh, tell that story that when you were researching the book and you went down there and ran into a cop, what he said to you.
This will be offensive, I'm sure, to somebody. I couldn't find Ragged Island the first time I went there, and I pulled over. There's a little memorial to Vietnam soldiers that's across the street. Mm-hmm. I didn't see the entrance to Ragged Island. I pulled over there and was looking around, and I'm trying to figure out on my GPS where the hell that park is, because it's showing that I'm there, but I don't see it. Mm-hmm. And a cop pulled up and he said, "You having car problems?" And I said, "No, I'm looking for Ragged Island." He said, "Oh, you're here for a blowjob or for some weed?" And I said, "I appreciate the offers, either." And I said, why would you say that? And he goes, "Oh, it's a well-known area for homosexual activity, and it's a well-known drug exchange area." And I said, "No, I'm doing a book." And I explained to him what I was doing. He showed me, "Oh, you're right across the street from it. You just got to drive over there and go in." But he said, this place has always had that reputation. It's just a creepy place. And that's always stuck with me.
When I went there years ago with one of the investigators and they walked me through the crime scene or potential crime scene for Robin and David, one of the striking things was, even though this sandy parking area, which appears in photographs and you talk about it in A Special Kind of Evil, is actually quite close to the James River Bridge, which is a long bridge.
It's right next door.
Right there.
But if you're on the bridge, you can't see Ragged Island.
Exactly, because the structure of the bridge actually blocks your view of the parking lot. So you wouldn't witness anything from up above, and the traffic on that side of the bridge is driving away from Ragged Island. So unless you were in the passenger seat and completely turned yourself around, you would not see anything that was going on in that parking area, despite the fact that it's quite close to this major bridge.
Yeah. Ragged Island it's a creepy place altogether. And it was funny because I talked with one of the family members who told me when they went out there one time, there was gunshots going off. You could hear gunshots in the area. And it's just not a place you want to go after hours.
Not at all. I think we may need to do a speed round here real quick. So Allison asks, is it true that Keith Call's car seat was all the way forward for a person around 5'5"? Keith was 6 feet, and we know that Wilmer was short.
We know that the car seat was all the way forward. That I know. How that relates to the size of Wilmer, I haven't crunched it. A lot depends on people's leg length to really determine that. And I would imagine the FBI should be taking a look at that.
Okay. Allison also asked, can you confirm that fishing line was used to tie up Rebecca and or Kathy?
What I was told by Irv Wells, and I put this in the book, was it was a nautical line. And I think I actually put it in all caps in the book because Irv really highlighted that. He indicated it was nautical line. Now, I don't know. I have seen the crime scene photographs. It's very hard to tell from those crime scene photographs what type of line it is.
I'll add, I'm highly confident it was not fishing line. The rope is larger than that. It is the kind of rope that is used on a boat, but I believe it's a larger diameter, and it is not fishing line to my eye.
Yeah, fishing line, you're looking at even a 130-pound test, I think you're going to be having a hard time strangling somebody with it. The line is visible as well in the crime scene photograph. So I agree with Bill. I think it's a nautical line, but I don't know any of the details beyond that. And the FBI should still have that evidence.
This may involve a little bit of gruesome speculation here, Blaine, but Hailey wants to know, where do you think Keith and Sandy were disposed of? Are they on the water or are they on the land?
I firmly believe at this point that they were intercepted on the land on the way back to Cassandra's house. And given the implication of Wilmer and his use of a boat, I believe that they were deposited somewhere. I don't think they were alive at all when the police were watching the Wilmers. I don't think they were tied up somewhere being held captive. That isn't a trait of the Colonial Parkway murder. He wasn't that kind of killer. I think this is an instance where they were killed and their bodies were deposited somewhere in the water, I believe. Now, bear in mind, the FBI did aerial searches and water searches of the York River. But these guys operated all the way up through the Northern Neck, which is up to the Rappahannock. Where they may have dumped the bodies or deposited the bodies, where he may have dumped them, I don't know. I honestly have no idea.
Question from Charlie. Are you aware if the FBI has surveillance images of the areas around Camp Perry, Cheatham Annex, or the Naval Weapons Station?
I have no idea if the FBI does have images of that.
I was told years ago by a well-informed law enforcement officer that they actually did seek out photographs of this type. And actually, I heard a crazy story, and I don't know if it's true or not, that they actually sought satellite imagery of.
They actually requested it from the Russians,
but I don't know if they ever got it.
No, they didn't get it. But they asked the
really
Russians.
Scary. Wow.
They asked the Russians during the Cold War. Irv told me the story. He said, we reached out to the Russians and asked them for spy images of Camp Perry because they may have been photographing at the time the murders took place. And they never got those images because 1980s, it's Cold War.
And
the idea of the Russians spying on Camp Perry and then us going to them and saying that is
totally
sorry, that blew my mind a little bit. I'm sorry.
Camp Peary, I mean, it's well known it's the CIA.
Yeah.
And you've also got a nuclear weapons storage facility up in that area at the naval base. And that whole area was under surveillance, I am sure, by the Russians.
Last question. Now that all of this new information has come to light over the last 21 days, can we expect second edition of A Special Kind of Evil? How are you going to integrate all this information into the book?
My publishers asked me to write a new epilogue and follow-up chapter to the book. I've told them I think it's a little early still, and a lot is dependent on us getting information. So far, I'm being stonewalled almost everywhere. I'm getting tangible information. That can be an implication that they're working the case so actively that they don't want the information out there, or that they don't want it out there because it's going to be embarrassing to them. One way or the other, I'm going to continue my efforts, and I'm using every little backdoor I know to get information from various sources. And I don't usually reveal how I do that, but you'll see the end results of that. And I got arrest records for these guys, so that's a good start. And I'm talking to people up in Lancaster, and one court clerk said she was going to buy the book, so I thought that was good.
Will you come back and talk with us again as the case unfolds?
Absolutely. Anytime you guys want me back. My goal is not to sell books because the books have already sold. My goal is to solve this case for the families. I have deep connection with several of the family members and correspond with them, and we just want to see these things brought to justice. So that's where I'm at.
Blaine, thank you for all of your hard work and your advocacy on this case. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate you taking the time to come on Mind Over Murder today.
No problem. It's great coming on. Thanks for having me.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.